This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injuries and additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. President Donald Trump's case for leaving Kilmar Abrego Garcia to rot in an El Salvadoran prison continues to collapse. We just had a conservative appeals court judge tear into the administration, pronouncing the denial of basic due process to this man shocking. But today we're going to focus on a particular aspect of Trump's argument, the claim that Abrego Garcia was a member of the MS-13 gang and therefore a dangerous criminal. You can't overstate how central this is to the administration's case. It's the primary rationale for refusing to bring him back from El Salvador in the first place. So we're talking about all of this with someone who has done deep research into MS-13, Eric Hirschberg, a professor of government at American University and a leading contributor to a major report for Insight Crime on the MS-13 gang. Eric, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with Trump, just to catch people up. When Abrego Garcia, a Salvadoran, was first detained in 2019 in the U.S., he was identified by a Maryland police officer as a member of MS-13 based on very thin evidence. He was subsequently given withholding of removal status, barring his removal to El Salvador, but that's exactly what the administration did illegally in March. Speaking to reporters, here's what Trump just said.
You're talking about Abrego Garcia, is that the one? Yeah. Is an illegal alien MS-13 gang member and foreign terrorist. This comes out of the State Department and very legitimate sources. I mean, I assume I'm just giving you what they handed to me, but this was supposed to be certified stuff.
Eric, note that Trump says here that he's been handed this information. It's plainly obvious that he has no understanding whatsoever of the details. Your thoughts on this?
Well, Trump has made references to MS-13 for years with no knowledge of the details. And what he does in the excerpt that you shared a moment ago is a kind of typical Trumpian gesture, which is saying, well, I don't know, but I've heard it said, or it is they say. This is the classic conspiracy theory way of conveying disinformation. In this case, he attributes it to the State Department, but qualifies that as he just assumes that the State Department has good intel that enables them to have reached this conclusion.
Yeah, I think what he's referring to there, and this is a guess because who the hell knows what's going through his head, is this idea that MS-13 has been designated a terrorist organization. I don't believe the State Department has commented specifically on this particular case of Abrego Garcia. So it makes the whole thing even more absurd. I mean, he says he was just handed this information. He says, yeah, it's probably accurate, right? I think it's credible. that really shows me that this is someone who is not thinking even slightly about the details, even though he's making this enormous life and death decision about this man.
Yeah, well, again, that kind of indifference to the fortune of other people is a hallmark of Trump's behavior in the presidency and indeed his behavior in the public arena for decades. And he's demagogued questions of crime. He's demagogued questions of immigration. He's demagogued questions of depictions of people who are unlike us, who are invading the country. I mean, this is his stock and trade.
Very well said. Let's back up a bit. Can you give us a very brief overview of what MS-13 is and what it's doing in Maryland?
Sure. So MS-13 was a street gang established in the mid-1980s in the Los Angeles area, where Salvadoran migrants who were basically refugees from the Civil War of the 1980s migrated to California and were vulnerable to violence from established street gangs. And so MS-13 arises as a response of that vulnerable community. And it becomes its own independent criminal street gang. And as those folks are deported to El Salvador in the 1990s, the gang takes root in Salvador and became an extremely violent and extremely destructive force in El Salvador. But at the same time, there were networks of MS-13 still on the West Coast. And there arose networks of MS-13 in metropolitan Washington, D.C., which, of course, is one of the principal destinations of Salvadoran migrants. And so we were really never persuaded that this is a transnational gang, though that's the label that it's been given by the U.S. government. But it is a gang that has a presence in multiple locations.
Right. And we should probably clarify that they are capable of horrific violence and so forth. They also have sort of a social role as well. Can you talk about those two dual things very briefly?
Yeah, well, both things. So the social role, these gangs take on the role of governing entities in some locations where the state is absent. This is certainly characteristic in El Salvador, where the state doesn't provide for security, doesn't provide for order, doesn't provide some kinds of basic social and community services. And the gangs, like organized crime groups in many different settings, take on some of these kinds of social functions. MS and the other Salvadoran gangs have tended to use highly performative extreme violence as a way of establishing both their identity and of asserting their influence. And one of the things certainly that alarmists about gang presence here in the U.S. and in El Salvador as well, where the gangs, in fact, were enormously destructive and enormously disruptive to people's ability to live safe everyday lives. One of the things that gets highlighted is the degree to which gory violence, macabre violence has been a hallmark of MS-13. And that's very real.
Spring is finally here. For us in DC, that means cherry blossom, warmer weather, and more breaking news each and every day. To stay up to date on all the news that you need to know, there's no better place than the DSR Network. And there's no better way to enjoy the DSR Network than to become a member. Members enjoy an ad-free listening experience, access to our Discord community, exclusive content, and more. Use code DSR2025 for a 40% off discount on sign-up at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's code DSR2025 at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Thank you and enjoy the show.
So let's drill down into the specifics. Trump claimed he was actually handed something. If so, what it would have been is the gang field interview sheet filled out by a Prince George's County cop when Abrego Garcia was detained in 2019. As we reported at the New Republic, that cop was subsequently suspended and indicted for serious misconduct, but put that aside for a sec. The gang field interview sheet makes two key claims tying him to MS-13. We're going to go through both of them slowly. The first one is that he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and hoodie with imagery of rolls of money with the eyes, ears, and mouth of the presidents on the bills covered. It's a little cryptic from the report what that exactly means. But Eric, is this clothing necessarily indicative of membership in MS-13? And what do you make of this description of the imagery?
Well, first of all, I don't think that I'm aware of any research that would identify that clothing as somehow emblematic of MS-13. What I would say is that in our research, looking into the presence and the nature and organization activities of MS-13 in the greater Washington, D.C. area, one of the things that we found quite striking was the degree to which law enforcement officials were not able to correctly identify who was part of the gang and who was not. So the idea that this gang identification sheet is authoritative information, certainly based on our work several years ago, including in Prince George County, we would not have considered that a reliable source.
Eric, can you tell us a little more about the work that you did in the PG County and DC metro area and what it said about the difficulty that authorities have in identifying members of the gang?
Yes. Well, one of the things that we did in the project was we would ask law enforcement officials to enable us to interview people who were detained under their jurisdiction and who were members of gangs. And we would find then that some of the people they referred us to were clearly, as best we could tell, not part of the gang.
It just seems like this whole enterprise is really deeply flawed, and for understandable reasons. This is complicated stuff. These are complex social phenomena we're talking about here. The second claim in the Maryland cops' gang field interview sheet that's supposed to tie Abrego Garcia to MS-13 is the claim that a confidential source said that he's a member of the Western Clique. His lawyers point out that this operates primarily in New York, where he never lived. Eric, what do you make of this assertion? Would you place much stock in this confidential source, and is the general claim credible?
Well, the general claim is plausible, but I don't see precisely why an anonymous source whose information we have no basis for verifying, and we don't see any other profile that would enable us to associate this individual with MS-13. I mean, I think we don't have any information about particular criminal activity that this person is said to have carried out. We don't have any, whether it's robbery, whether it's car theft, or whatever it might be, that would associate him with a clique of MS-13 operating in Maryland.
The whole thing that makes this so ridiculous, which you just put your finger on, is that he was never charged with, let alone convicted of, any crime related to gang activity or any crime at all. I want to bring up another aspect of all this. One of the reasons Abrego Garcia received withholding of removal status in 2019 is because he feared that if he were sent back to El Salvador, he'd face harm from the Barrio 18 gang, which had threatened his family with death in attempting to extort his mother over her pupusa business. I've heard this described as supposed evidence that he was in MS-13 and that this is why he feared a rival gang. But Eric, my understanding is that a threat like this doesn't have to do with membership in a rival gang. It's more that Barrio 18 is threatening him for not doing their bidding in territory they've marked as theirs, kind of similar to how gangs carved up territory in The Godfather. If you remember all the, the chieftains sitting around saying that, who's going to have what. Can you talk about this?
The way that Barrio 18 or MS-13 operates in El Salvador is that they extort local businesses, self-employed, corner stores, bodegas, and so on and so forth, bus drivers, and you have to pay or else you get torched. And what seems to have happened is that his mother didn't pay. And at that point, not only is she subject to violence, but anybody related to her is also subject to violence. And the fact that he fled is itself an act of defiance that is subject to retribution by the gang. And it's also the case that even if he weren't a member of MS-13, if he lived in a territory that was governed by MS-13, then he automatically becomes a target of violence from Barrio. So there's all sorts of reasons to treat credibly the basic narrative that led the immigration court to withhold the order of removal.
So speaking of this broader narrative, my understanding of the way MS-13 functions is that to bring people in, you're usually getting teenagers, right? Not people in their 20s. So the whole narrative that the Trump administration is spinning makes you wonder, why didn't Abrego Garcia get drawn into gang activity earlier when he was a teenager? I mean, he would have been more vulnerable. He arrived in the United States at the age of 16. And so if he had been drawn into MS-13 as a teenager, there'd be a paper trail. There'd be a record of activity, of gang activity. There's none of that. Am I right about this? Is it likely that he'd be pulled in his 20s?
Well, I think one of the things that we just don't understand in this case is what is the criminal activity that he's associated with. And so if he were an active member of the gang, he would be involved in criminal activities. And there's been no charge, as best I can tell, of his participation in any such activities. Recruitment into the gang typically happens during one's teenage years. The gangs target young people who are directionless, who don't have roots in their community. They often have broken families, and they offer a kind of family. They offer a community. They offer membership in something. And so, yes, typically the entry into gang activity and gang networks happens during the teenage years. And so, yes, it would be rather unusual for somebody to first connect to the gang in their 20s in an environment where he was working. Doesn't really hold together very well.
Right. Putting it all together, a lot of what we actually know about MS-13 and Abrego Garcia's specific overall trajectory casts even more doubt on the claim that Trump is making, which again, he is basing on something that he said was handed to him. Is that about the size of things? The facts just don't add up in any way, do they?
Well, the facts don't add up in any way, but I think they do in the sense that we know that for years, Trump has demagogued the image of MS-13. This is the person who talks about migrants poisoning the blood of Americans. This is the person who talks about vermin, who talks about contamination. And there's no loyalty here to facts or to decency or to civility. This is somebody who is an opportunist and who deploys fear of outsiders, who deploys resentment against migrants, and for whom to be able to say MS-13, transnational gang, terrorist organization, is all just part of a demagogic toolkit.
Eric Hirschberg, thank you so much for coming on with us. This was super enlightening.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your reporting.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.